Just hours after two young journalists were shot dead on live TV, presidential candidates on both sides started talking about guns. Will this incident finally be the tipping point and spur some common sense reforms? Then Andrew Cuomo and Bill de Blasio aren't the first New York governor and mayor to fight. This one might be more personal than the other feuds, but instead of blaming the personalities, should we blame the system? Also, Hurricane Katrina 10 years later. We're going to talk to the guy who was the communications director for Louisiana's governor during the storm. He'll tell us how the politics made that disaster and the response even worse. Good evening and welcome to RFL. I'm Andrew Whitman, in tonight for Richard French. It happens every shooting, which sadly means it happens a lot. Democrats call for better gun control, Republicans defend the Second Amendment and resist change, and so nothing gets done in Washington. And that has got the father of Allison Parker, the reporter who was gunned down in Virginia yesterday, furious at lawmakers.
But there has to be a way to force politicians that are cowards and in the pockets of the NRA to come to grips and make sense, have sensible laws so that crazy people can't get guns. It can't be that hard.
And Hillary Clinton agrees that it's time to act.
We have got to do something about gun violence in America. And I will take it on. It's a very political, difficult issue in America. But I believe we are smart enough, we are compassionate enough to figure out how to balance the legitimate Second Amendment rights with preventive measures and control measures.
As for the Republican side of the argument, their presidential frontrunner Donald Trump says he's not convinced we have a gun problem.
Would you do something different with gun policy?
Well, I don't think I would, because this is really a sick person. This isn't a gun problem. This is a mental problem. You know, you're not going to get rid of all guns. So I know one thing. If you tried to do it, the bad guys would have them, to use an expression, and the good folks would abide by the law. They'd be hopeless, and it would be a hopeless situation for them.
Trump and other Republicans say gun laws aren't the issue. In this case, the accused gunman passed a background check and legally purchased 2 Glocks from a licensed gun dealer. Police say one of those Glocks was used to kill the 2 journalists and then himself. So will guns become a big campaign issue, or at least a campaign issue at all? And will it actually help lead to some reforms? Let's bring in our panel tonight. Richard Brodsky is with us. He's a former Democratic New York State Assemblyman and now a senior fellow at Demos and a professor at NYU. Dominic Carter is with us, political journalist and author. Scott Vanderhoff is an attorney and former 5-term Rockland County executive. And we're also joined tonight by attorney Michael Sussman. Thank you very much for being with us. So first of all, nobody thinks that this is actually going to lead to any aggressive gun control, right? It didn't happen after Newtown. It hasn't happened after any of these.
It's not going to lead to passive gun control. It's not a matter of aggressive. What this poor bereaved father did is he put his finger on the easiest thing to do, which is to deal with crazy people with guns. Put aside training, put aside repeating rifles, put all that aside. Mental health checks, the easiest thing. What is it, 90% of the country supports it? And it's still not going anywhere. We have a political problem that's going to have to be solved politically, and for better or worse, these awful tragedies are not going to move people appreciably.
You know, figuring that this wasn't going to become an active political issue, or at least you're not going to see progress in Congress, the question or the focus shifts to the presidential candidates. Does this become an issue in the presidential campaign, and then maybe it re-enters the national dialogue? Scott, is there any way that you can see Republican candidates embracing any measure of gun control?
Probably not, except that, well, I hate to do this, Richard's correct here in this sense. This is a mental health issue, which people's eyes glaze over on mental health issues. Instead of focusing on the gun, as Hillary does, it's a mental health issue. And the issue, the real issue here, in my opinion, are background checks, except in this case it didn't quite work, and how we deal with our mental health. It's an enormous field, and it's totally societally under approached. And I think, frankly, if you could approach it that way instead of the Second Amendment issue, you know, approach it on the question of who gets the license to have a gun, I think it's different. And perhaps a Republican could come around on that.
They tried that, and your party refused to back it. Do you believe there are Republican presidential candidates who would back a mental health background check more strenuous than it currently exists Are there
I think there could be. I mean, I think people like Kasich and others who might be a little bit more moderate have the ability to deal with that issue. Not, again, the Second Amendment issue, but the issue of mental health and how we do background checks on individuals. It's not that complicated. It just needs to be pushed. And I think,
I don't agree. First of all, I think it's all in the doing. I think this mental health background check, quite frankly, is a bit of a cop-out. I think it's an easy cop-out for people rhetorically, but in the doing, I don't think that it would be effectual. I think you would have tremendous problems in many of the states where these issues are most acute. Look, the problems of the Supreme Court of the United States, let's put it very clearly. You cannot have strong gun control legislation or measures when you have a Supreme Court that by a 5-4 measure has essentially said the Second Amendment gives you a right to do pretty much whatever you want with a gun. And that's what they've done.
But
I think they're
they
wrong.
also allow for gun control laws to be put in place if Congress would get the stomach to do it.
Very, very modest gun control laws. If those gun control laws start really taking guns from people on the basis that you guys are talking
you can't
about.
do that. It's the Second Amendment.
The Second
You can't
Amendment's
do
been,
that.
you're an attorney and I'm an attorney. The Second Amendment has nothing to do with the discussion. It's a facade. The Second Amendment has been totally misinterpreted. You read the Second Amendment, it's a 5-4 split on the Supreme Court. That's what we got.
You know, I'd like to agree with you, but the problem is that even if you didn't have that Supreme Court case, the political reality in the United States is that there aren't the votes in legislative bodies to pass any
What did
kind.
the Supreme Court, Richard? The Supreme Court ruled on Chicago and Washington, D.C. where they had legislation. So there are states, there are areas where you would have gun control legislation pass, but the Supreme Court's made it impossible to implement it. So you're right, not the whole country, you can do it.
Dominic?
I've been saying this for months. My good friend gets mad when I focus on elected officials on some issues. Things are so bad in terms of reform or gun control that the county exec and the legislator may be correct that the mental health component might be the only way to backdoor this in and get some type of constraints in place. What we're dealing with today, this is one issue that is bipartisan by far. You have Republicans that are in the pocket financially of the NRA, and you damn sure have Democrats that are in the pocket of the NRA. Politicians are afraid the NRA is an 800-pound gorilla. If you challenge them, they will petition you, they will run someone against you, they will give a ton of money against your opponent. Rule 101 for politics from a journalist perspective. Not, you're doing good. You haven't attacked me
I
yet.
just kept my mouth
You're
shut.
doing good. You're doing good. Rule 101 from a political point of view for elected officials, political survival, getting reelected. The only way you're going to change this father that's upset, you're going to have a movement, a real movement that says either you with us or you with them. Now make your choice.
I want to get back into the mental health aspect for just one second because that has come up a lot as being the response. And Michael, in New York State, I know there's a very high bar for, let's say, involuntary commitment of somebody. If somebody's a danger, they either have to check themselves into a place or there's a real... Can you explain a little bit about that threshold? Because if that's the threshold that's applied to banning people from getting weapons...
Yeah. Basically, to be involuntarily committed in New York, we have a very strong edifice, very strong, both legislatively and judicially. You have to be shown to be a danger to yourself or a danger to others. And the standards for that are not that predictive. You pretty much have had to do something. Now, yes, you might say something that's really viewed as dangerous, but courts are loath to commit people. And that's why I say I think this mental health is a bit of a facade. Because what is the standard going to be? How are you going to define and articulate a standard and say that person can't have a gun?
Well,
But
that's
you
the
can't
point.
use the standards in New York. I mean, you got to use New York.
What is the standard?
You've got to change the standards. You've got to make it different across the...
What is it
and
gonna
one of the
be?
things
That's what I'm asking
one
you.
has to obviously recognize that mental health problems is a very serious issue in this country. And most folks don't focus on that.
You fell into his trap.
Exactly.
You want to make it easier for the state to incarcerate people without having committed
And I didn't say anything about incarceration. I said about getting a
But for
a
involuntary
check.
commitments, you would have to...
involuntary commitment?
He says it would be a different standard. And all I'm
You would-
saying is, what would the standard be? You have to articulate a standard, and then what I'm trying to say is you have to apply that standard. And to the extent it's a more permissive standard, the NRA that Dominic correctly talks about, is going to be yelling and screaming at you that what you're trying to do is go backdoor and regulate guns.
How about this,
right?
If there is any kind of incident of a kind that is disclosable on a license application, then you have to get a psychiatric evaluation and be
Richard,
passed.
this
Would
man
you-
who killed these two people, you know what they're saying about him today? We've heard about what they're saying. He had racial rage, right? He filed a lot of discrimination lawsuits. He had also, he hadn't shown, from what I heard, anything that would be characterized by either of your statements. He wouldn't have been deprived because of a mental health background
Well, he wasn't,
check,
but
right?
but the point is you got to change it. And if you see a
No,
fellow
but
like
he
this-
wouldn't have been. If you have your standard, he would have
wasn't.
still gotten a gun.
he did.
I think another aspect is mental health is such an overlooked part of healthcare overall in this country. It's stigmatized, and don't forget, this guy was out of a job, which means
But
he didn't
Andrew-
have health care,
but
which would have
Andrew-
covered mental health.
But what's the alternative? As the county exec just stated, if you don't go backdoor route in terms of mental health issues, you think the NRA is going to roll over when it comes to the Second Amendment?
The alternative is what you said. It's a movement.
Right, it's a movement. It's either you with us or you against
There
us.
are two kinds, broadly defined, of gun violence going on. There's the systematic, we don't pay much attention, the urban violence level. That's a problem for people who live in communities with a lot of guns.
Yes.
But the thing that's attracted the attention are these insane people with guns. There are things that can be tried that you might not like and you might not like, but have to address the mass murder aspects of this, the individual acts of mass murder. That, I think, is where you get the initial break in the all or nothing facade, and you can start dealing with that. Someone's got to provide a yesable proposition, something the other side could agree to, and let the politics work.
It's all based on predictions. And the problem I have with it is that after the fact, you can say, yes, that person manifested qualities which should have prevented him from getting a gun.
Right.
But you devise a usable test that beforehand is going to keep guns out of that person's
It's been
hand.
done in other places. And the problem with your argument is you're just focusing on guns. It's not the gun. I mean, he would have used a knife or something else. I mean, that's
No, I'm
all
not
these
just
folks.
I'm saying
I
what
think-
the
well, I
problem
think
with the
Hillary
mental health
Clinton and
approach
others-
is. I didn't just focus on the guns.
I think you and Hillary Clinton and others are focusing on the guns. It's not the guns.
But
it has
Scott,
to do with
if
mental
this
health
guy had
issues.
used knives instead of guns, I mean, I think there's a much more realistic chance that
People
three
are gonna
people wouldn't
die.
be dead. I mean,
Agreed, but a person who's crazy, is going to use a weapon of one sort or another. That's my point.
Guns are the weapon of choice for mass murder. And there are things you can do that are gun specific, and they need to get done. Having Mr. Negative here say no to everything may
Well, I
be
thought
the
you
way.
said I'm normally Mr. Negative.
Well, you've been supplanted.
The fire is coming to me.
last question, and maybe I'm half hoping that we don't have an answer for this one, but we asked after Newtown if that was going to be a tipping point. We asked after Charleston. We asked, can we even conceive of an incident that might actually serve as a tipping point? Would it just be such carnage?
The
Would it be
only one, and he's going to say I'm being very negative, the only one that's going to work is when you start taking the money out of politicians' pockets. It's as simple as that.
He's wrong.
You have senators that are literally bought off by the NRA.
They're bought off not by the money, which is real but not dispositive. They're bought off by the fact that the NRA has constituencies that vote. Until the
That
rest
too,
of the
that
nation
too.
gets together and decides to countervote,
That
you're
too.
not going to get a chance.
I'm honestly not even sure if we lost a key public figure to gun violence that would change anything. I mean, I'm honestly not sure that I can conceive of an
You
incident
had the
so
Arizona
bad.
situation. It didn't change anything.
Right. I mean, I honestly, I don't even know what that would
I
be.
think just quickly, I think what works is local regulation that shows efficacy. I think if Washington and Chicago had a chance to regulate gun usage as they proposed, I think they were reasonable regulations, and that worked in those communities where you have the urban issues that Richard spoke about, that might have set a model that people could have argued from. Supreme Court said no to both of them, and I think that's very significant in this discussion.
We want to get you at home involved in this conversation. We're inviting you to head over to Facebook or Twitter or both and sound off on today's question. Will the Virginia shooting finally cause or lead to some common sense gun control reforms? When we come back, many people are upset about the Daily News cover this morning showing the moment right before the reporter was shot. But is it important for people to see those images and even the videos from the gunman, even though or perhaps because they're difficult to look at? Stay with us.